Without further ado, let me just introduce to you our presenter today. Her name is Dianne Tyers, and she has worked in ESL for 23 years now in teaching, management, training, and program development positions with public and private sector educational organizations. So she now runs Advanced Consulting for Education, or ACE, right? So, yep. So we have here her contact information. If you're interested to contact her, we'll have this information on the My English Online website as well. So I will now give the floor to Dianne. Okay, so let me just pull up her slides first. Okay, and all right, so here we go, Dianne.
Okay, it worked. Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to the session on yes, there are patterns to English spelling. All right, can you just tell me if I'm coming through clearly? Okay, I'm going to assume that I'm coming through. Okay. Okay, good. So I am coming through. So I'm going to start off the session by telling you actually why I developed this presentation. And it starts with a story of me observing a new teacher. And that's one of the things that I do with my work is I observe new teachers and give them feedback. And I was observing a new teacher, and she got the inevitable question from a student, why is such and such word spelled this way? And I kind of cringed at her answer. She just said, well, you know, English spelling is crazy, just memorize it. And she just shut down all discussion. I'm like, no, that's not what you want to do. And then I was like, well, what do we want to do when we get these spelling questions? So I started to investigate this whole issue of spelling, and hence I developed this presentation as part of my investigation. So I'm going to share it with you. And as Ara mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. And as long as the pace is going fine, I'll answer the questions as we go. If we're starting to run out of time, I'll hold the questions till the end, just for the final Q&A session. So we're going to investigate what should we do, or how do we answer when students ask this question, you know, why is something spelled this way? And, you know, how do I manage English spelling? So we're going to start by actually answering the question why spelling is important. Interestingly enough, spelling is kind of one of the skills that has fallen off the radar of a lot of teachers, simply because there's so many other things that we need to deal with in the classroom. But it's something that I think we need to put back on our radars, and I'll walk you through why. And then we'll actually take a look at what spelling entails at the neurological and brain processing level. What are the processes that come into play when we're actually spelling something? Then we'll start to look at all the different ways that we can approach spelling and help students to find patterns and things and tools that will help them understand how to spell. And we'll also look at historical influences on English spelling, so that particularly with our intermediate to advanced level courses, we can actually explain to them why the spelling is the way it is, rather than just saying, okay, just memorize it. We can actually start to give them some of the background to the English language so they can appreciate where this spelling actually comes from. And then finally, we'll take a look at some activities that we can use to effectively teach spelling to our students. So that's what we have in store. So there's quite a number of reasons why we do actually want to get spelling back into our classrooms. The first one is quite obvious. Spell check, even though it's a great tool, it doesn't actually always identify all of the errors. So our students, if they're relying solely on spell check, they're actually not necessarily going to have accurate work. Then the next points are all based on research. And when I refer to research, at the end of the presentation, I've given you the main papers that and books that I've pulled information from. So that's the research that I'm referring to. So the research says, first of all, that when students can spell well, they can read well. So good spellers are good readers. So if we help our students with their spelling skills, then we're also at the same time helping them with their reading skills. And good spellers also make good writers. So when we teach our students spelling, we're also helping them improve their writing skills. Regardless of whether they're writing with a word processor, when they improve their spelling, they become a better writer. And the next one's really interesting, particularly if you've got high-level EAP students or occupation-specific language students. Good spellers have a greater range of vocabulary. So the research shows that the more comfortable students are with the spelling process, the greater the range of vocabulary that they use, simply because they're more confident that the words they're spelling are actually spelled correctly. So this is really important when students are writing academic papers, for example, and they need to use a wider range of vocabulary. If they're good spellers, they're going to use that vocabulary. And then the final point is really important for our occupation-specific students. Good speller and our workplace and business students as well. Good spellers are perceived as professional and competent. So when students are writing emails and their spelling is correct, people are perceiving them as being very competent and very professional. So these are all really compelling reasons to make sure that we tackle spelling in our classes, and not just at our lower level classes, all the way through to the higher levels as well. So here's a classic definition of spelling. So spelling is the application of phonemic awareness. So that's sound awareness. So students have to actually know what the sounds are in English. Then they have to have alphabetic knowledge to letters. So they have to know the letters. This is interesting for students who come from languages with different writing systems, different script systems. And then they have to have knowledge of that orthographic or writing system. So how is language translated into a written system in English? So you can start to see that there's three key pieces to what spelling is. So spelling knowledge has these three key pieces. So we have the phonemic awareness. So students have to get their heads around the sounds of the different phonemes in English. A classic example here would be a Japanese student who can't differentiate the L sound and the R sound because those phonemes are not differentiated in Japanese. So students with very different phonemic systems in their L1s will find even basic phonemic awareness challenging. Then students need alphabetic knowledge, so they need to recognize, name, and produce letters. And once again, this is a challenge for our students who come from languages with a non-Latin-based alphabet. So students who come from a Chinese language background, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, any of the Slavic languages that use the Cyrillic systems, these students actually need basic alphabetic knowledge. Okay. And then finally, the most challenging piece with English, which creates a lot of the spelling issues, is mapping those phonemic sounds, those phonemes, onto the alphabet. So that's called orthographic awareness. So this is how we actually take our sounds and map them into the writing system. So our students can have challenges at all three of these different components of spelling. Most of the challenges arise, however, in this orthographic piece. And that's where most of our teaching should focus. There are additional skills that come into spelling, and these are skills that as our students get higher in their language proficiency, we want to make sure we layer these in as well. So students need to have some morpheme awareness, so they need to know the different morphemes, the smallest units of meaning that exist in English. They need to understand syllables. They need to know grammar and syntax, for example. They need to know that the regular past tense has an ED on the end. And then semantic organization at the word, sentence, and discourse level. So they need to know how words are put together in bigger chunks. Okay, all of these layers help our students become more sophisticated and accurate spellers. And so you can start to see that spelling really doesn't stop at the beginner level. It goes all the way through the language learning process. So when we're looking at spelling, there's a process that goes on in our heads. And there are two processes that researchers have identified when it comes to English spelling. And this is phonological processing. And phonological processing is in our brains, we basically put the word together piece by piece in sound units. So here's the first sound of the word, here's the second sound, here's the third sound. I'm going to put them all together, and I have my word. Okay. Then the other type of processing is called orthographic processing. And this is basically we just memorize what the word looks like. So our brain stores a picture of the word, and that's what we access when we spell the word. Some of you may have encountered these two pieces in your education system. I'm not sure how old the audience is, but if you're my age, you would have had the phonological processing approach. And if you're younger than me, you probably had the orthographic processing approach. So the phonological processing translates into the classroom as phonics. So if you learn to spell through a phonic system, that's phonological processing. And then the orthographic processing translates into a technique in the classroom called the whole word approach. And this is where you might have had just flashcards with lots and lots and lots of words, and you memorized, your teacher would hold them up and you would just memorize the spelling of these different words. Here's what the research says about which approach is more effective. The research says that the orthographic processing approach on its own is the least effective way to go. So it is the least effective approach, this one on its own. What the research says is phonological processing plus some orthographic processing is the most effective combination for effective spelling. And here's why. So phonological processing really helps students tie the sounds together with the written script, okay? And it allows them to tackle new words. So they can get a word that they've never seen before, and they can start to pull it apart and figure out how it's pronounced or how it's spelled going the other direction. Where orthographic processing comes in is with the really small, high-frequency, short words. So words such as the, obviously a, it, and, again, any short word, the brain can more effectively store it just as an image and access it as an image. Okay, and so the retrieval can be very quick with these short, high-frequency words. So this is where we want to get our students to, where they can do phonological processing for the majority of their words, and then orthographic processing or the whole word approach for those short, high-frequency words that they encounter. Okay. So that's kind of what happens at the brain level when it comes to spelling. And so we're going to keep this in mind as we take a look at how we're going to work with our students in the classroom on their spelling. So here's where English, we're going to talk about why English is so challenging as a language when it comes to spelling and putting our sound system into our writing system, like mapping the two together. And one of the terms that we need to define is Phony Missa Tee. And I can never say that, so if I mess up the pronunciation, you'll have to excuse me. It ties up my tongue a bit. So Phony Missa Tee is basically the degree to which we can predict how a word is spelled from its pronunciation, or the other way around, what the pronunciation of a word is from its spelling. So a language with a high degree of Phony Missa Tee has a really direct correspondence between the sounds of the language and the letters that are representing those sounds. So an example of a language here would be Italian, because Italian is very close to the Latin alphabet. And so there's a really high degree of Phony Missa Tee to a language such as Italian, and Spanish is another one. A language with a low degree of Phony Missa Tee has a greater lack of predictability when it comes to either saying a word from its spelling or spelling a word from its pronunciation. Turkish is another one. That's a good addition. I didn't know that. Okay, so this is the challenge when it comes to spelling English, is that there's a low degree of Phony Missa Tee. Okay. And then here's another set of terms that we can use to express exactly the same concept. So we can say that a language has transparent orthography. That means it's very obvious how the sounds of the language connect with the alphabet of the language. So once again, this would be Italian, Spanish, and Turkish. So there's a really tight connection. So it's transparent orthography. And then at the opposite end, where English lies, unfortunately, is what we call opaque orthography, where that connection between sound and the sound system is not is not directly evident. And yes, I have some books to recommend. I'll get to those in a second. It's on one of the slides. There's some great books out there on this. Okay. So this is the second set of terms that we can use to describe exactly the same thing, that there's not this direct connection all the time with the sounds of English and the symbols that we use to represent it in writing. Okay. Poets have had a lot of fun with this opaque orthography of English. So I just pulled up one example, but you've probably seen lots of these circulated. The chaos, dearest creature in creation, studying English pronunciation. I will teach you in my verse. Sounds like corpse, core, horse, and worse. I will keep you, Susie, busy. Make your head with heat grow dizzy. Tear in eye, your dress I'll tear. So shall I, oh, hear my prayer. You can have a lot of fun with this, but this is a poem you can use with your students. I see some have memorized this at university, just to get them to understand, this opaque orthography, okay, if they haven't already figured it out. So that's the problem when it comes to English spelling, is this opaque orthography or the low degree of phony Missa Tee to the language. So how do we tackle this? So I'm going to walk through it, just a lot of different approaches that we can take to tackle this problem, okay? And so one of the approaches is to, first of all, get our students to recognize similarities amongst words. And there's 3 terms here that we can use and teach our students so they can start to draw connections. So we have homophones, are words that are pronounced the same, but they have a different meaning, and they may or may not be spelled the same. So we need to teach our students to recognize the homophones, particularly in high-frequency words, okay? This particular approach really helps with our high-frequency words. So, for example, we've got air and air. They sound exactly the same. And we've got red and red. They sound the same. So these are homophones, okay? We also want to teach our students to recognize homographs. So they're words that are written the same, and but they have a different meaning, and interestingly, they have a different word origin, and they may or may not be pronounced the same. Okay, I've given you one set that are pronounced the same and one that are pronounced differently. So we've got bear to carry and bear the animal. They're written exactly the same way, so they're homographs. And then we've got lead to conduct, and then we've got lead, the metal. Okay, so those do not sound the same, but they are homographs. Okay, so we want to teach our students to recognize these. And then homonyms are ones that you've probably heard of. These are words that are both homophones and homographs. Okay, they are exactly the same as another in sound, and they are exactly the same in spelling, but they have different meanings and usually different word origins. So here's an example: lean, which is to prop against, or lean as in thin. Okay, so one of the first approaches we can take to tackling this opaque orthography of English is to teach our students these 3 terms. So homographs, homophones, and homonyms. Okay, so that's one framework that we can use to start to tackle the problem. Okay, then the next, this is just an interesting piece to tell students, is that English is not quite as opaque as you might think. And so students initially learning the language might just get completely blown away by English spelling and just think it's a chaotic mess. But one of the reasons that English spelling looks so opaque is that it's the high-frequency words that have the irregular spellings. So a lot of the high-frequency words in the language, unfortunately, are the ones that our students encounter first. And so they get a little bit of a skewed impression of English spelling. It actually looks harder or more opaque than it is. If you look at the entire collection of English words, the number of irregular spellings decreases, or the percentage decreases. But when you just look at those high percentage words, that's where a lot of the irregularity resides. And the historical most of this irregularity comes from historical origins. Okay, so you can, if your students are going crazy with English and just say there's no patterns, feel free to explain this to them, that a lot of the high frequency words in English do have those irregular patterns, but there's much more patterning in English spelling than you might think. Okay. So just to briefly, I am not an expert on the history of the English language, and I'll give you some resources if you want to dig into this a little bit more, but I'll just briefly take you through some of those historical influences on the language that have primarily impacted our high-frequency structural words in English. So English started with a base of Anglo-Saxon, okay, and then there was the Viking invasion, so there was influence of the Norse language. Then there was the Norman invasion from Normandy, so there was a French influence, and they also brought with them a Latin influence, so there was a heavy French and Latin influence. Then with the Renaissance, there was a very heavy Greek influence on the language. And then over time, English has kind of become this borrowing language, and it's become a highly influenced language. So it's been influenced by a lot of different languages after that core set of them influencing languages as well. So it's kind of fun when your students get to the intermediate level and above. You know, it's worth actually having a lesson on the history of English so that they can start to see where these different origins, what the different influences were. And you can have some fun. A great activity for the intermediate level and higher is actually show students some of the origins of the patterns, the letter patterns that they see. For example, some Norse spelling patterns are the GHT in these words. The WH is a Norse pattern, and the WR is a pattern. Here's a couple of other ones, the hard K and the S hard C here, and the KN combination here is another Norse pattern. There are lots and lots and lots of Latin French patterns. The ACTION or the CTION pattern here, ATION, the ILIAR pattern. These are all French. Some more French patterns here. I won't spend too much time on these. They're great, some really interesting, unique Greek patterns here. The THs are all Greek. The PHs are all Greek. This is my favorite, the PH-TH combination, which is a total tongue twister. That's Greek. The HY is Greek, and the AU here is also Greek. Okay. So this is an activity that you can do with your intermediate and above students is get lists of words and find out the origins of those letter combinations and have students explore those. There's a couple of great websites that allow you just to search an extensive database of English words and pull out words by patterns. So I've given you these two sites here. That's a good comment there, Sherry. Yes. People are always looking for origins of the words. It does actually help in the spelling if you can start to dig into the history. So there are two websites here. You can actually put word letter patterns in, and it'll give you lists of words that have those letter patterns in them. And so you can send your students to these sites and assign different groups of students different letter patterns to research, and they can find all the words with those letter patterns. It's a great activity for the intermediate level and above. Okay. And it lets them really appreciate the historical origins of the spelling system that we're working with. Then there are a few other historical events that influenced English spelling. And once again, with intermediate level and above, it's really good for students to actually know these historical influences so that they can just understand where this system came from. So the very first historical origin of our spelling challenges or our opaque orthography is the Latin alphabet. So English uses the Latin alphabet, and the Latin alphabet only has 5 vowels and it has 21 consonants. And so English doesn't have 5 vowels. It has either 14 or 16 vowels, depending on the dialect you're working with. And English doesn't have 21 consonants, it has 24 consonant sounds. So this was the initial challenge that people putting English into a writing system faced, is that they didn't have enough letters to work with. So they had to come up with combinations of words that would allow them to represent the sounds. And unfortunately, different people writing down the English language came up with different combinations. And so we ended up with a lot of variety. But this is the foundational challenge to English spelling, is we simply don't have enough letters to represent the number of sounds that we have in the language, because we're using a Latin alphabet, which was created for a language that had fewer vowel sounds and fewer fewer consonant sounds. Okay. Then the other influence is that English was originally written down by individual scribes, usually associated with the church. So if you can conjure in your mind an image of priests working alone in solitary cells in monasteries across England, that's basically how the language was originally written down. Okay, and so each individual scribe made different decisions about how to represent the sounds with the Latin alphabet, and they made different decisions. So we had a lot of variation right from the get-go because we had these scribes working in isolation. Then we started to get some standardization, but also some more variation with the advent of the printing press. So the printing press allowed for the mass production of the written word in English. And this allowed for printing press operators or owners to basically set the standards for spelling. So an owner would basically indicate, okay, here's how I want this word spelled, and here's how I want this word spelled, and then 100 books were published, and so that standard went out there. An interesting twist in this is that many of the printing press operators and owners were from Belgium. So when it came to deciding how to spell words, they actually based some of their decisions on Flemish, which was their native language. So so some of the English spelling decisions from the printing press era are based on Flemish. It's just a kind of a fun fact to know there. Then another historical event that influenced the spelling of English was the Great Vowel Shift. And what happened here was that the set of English vowels actually literally just shifted up the vowel continuum. And so vowels that were, it mostly affected our long vowels. So our long vowels shifted higher and further back. And they also, some of them became diphthongs. So unfortunately, there was a strange twist in history that just after we had started to standardize spelling with the printing press, the great vowel shift happened, and so our spoken word shifted away from our written word. So unfortunately, the timing on that didn't quite work how it should have. So the great vowel shift affected this disconnect between our spoken word and our written word. Okay, and then there were a few other historical initiatives to try and address the spelling issue. So at different points in time, different dictionary makers, different researchers tried to say, okay, we need to go back to the origins of this word. So, for example, the word debt, D-E-B-T, that used to be spelled D-E-T because they spelled it how it was said, but then researchers said, no, this word comes from Latin, so we have to put the B back in. So they tried to go back to historical roots and kind of messed up the spelling again. And there were initiatives to standardize spelling, particularly when dictionaries were being written. So those first dictionaries that came out, the authors also took it upon themselves to standardize the spelling. And then there were initiatives to align spelling to sound. The famous one, quite frankly, is with American English. There was an initiative when the American English dictionaries were first being written to align spelling to sound. And so that's where we get a difference in the spelling between Canadian English and American English and also British English, was that attempt to align sound with spelling. So these are just some fun pieces of the history of English that you can teach your intermediate and above students so that they can start to understand, where does some of this complexity or this opaque orthography come from. Here are some resources to take a look at. There's a great, it's a really fun YouTube. There's a couple of rude bits in it, so I apologize for those, but it's a really fun video that just takes you and your students through the history of English and highlights some of these spelling issues. So I recommend that one. And then English, the Birth of a Language is a bit lengthier and it's a more formal documentary type video, but it's also very, very informative. Okay. And then here are the books that I referred to earlier. This one is absolutely the best. David Crystal, I love his stuff. He's just an awesome writer. He's got this great book called Spell It Out, which walks you through all of these twists and turns in the history of English that have resulted in our current spelling system. Okay. And then this one, The History of English Spelling, is more like a reference book. It basically takes you through each of the languages that influenced English and shows you all of the word origins that relate back to those languages. So these are two great resources. Okay, so now let's tackle, so this is the background of why English is spelled the way it is. So how do we deal with this in the classroom? Now, the traditional approach to teaching spelling in the classroom, there's kind of two ways that we've traditionally done it. And the first way is incidentally. So as our students make spelling errors in class, we're like, no, hang on, you need to fix the spelling. Okay, so we teach spelling incidentally as it comes up when students are doing writing assignments, for example. Okay, and then the other traditional way to approach spelling is to just have a list of words, and usually the lists are moving from least complex words to more complex words. So we might start our lower level students off with words that have 4 letters in them, and then our next level of students may have 5 letters in them, and then we save the longer words for higher levels. I'm just going to check this question here. I am not familiar. So the question is, are Phonics Junior and the Phonics Game online spelling programs? I'm not familiar with those, so I'll have to get back to you on that question. So these are the two traditional ways that they're actual board games. Okay, that's good to know. So these are ways that we've traditionally taught spelling, but what I want to bring to your attention is that there's 2 other ways that we want to approach spelling as well as these 2 ways. And these are ways that really help us tap into these patterns. So there are 2 pattern approaches to teaching spelling. So the first one is it's a targeted approach to spelling, but we have students work systematically by letter patterns. So we work from the more commonly occurring letter patterns to the less commonly occurring letter patterns. So our spelling approach it's very much a phonics approach. Here are the letter patterns, and then here are the sounds that represent those letter patterns. Okay, so that's one targeted systematic approach that really taps into the patterns that do exist in spelling. Okay, then there's a targeted systematic way by sound. So instead of approaching it by letter pattern, we approach it by sound. So here's the ah sound. What are the letter patterns that go with the ah sound? Okay, and once again, we go from the more commonly occurring sounds to the less frequently occurring sounds. So these are 2 targeted approaches that we want to layer on top of our incidental approach and our word approach. Okay, so really focus on the patterns and help students identify the patterns and uncover the patterns and learn the patterns. Okay. So researchers have identified that there's kind of 4 steps that we want to take when we're teaching spelling. So the first one is the one that I've mentioned already. We want to take this systematic approach where we're uncovering patterns. So they call it systematic study strategies. So systematically working through the letter patterns and then also systematically working through the sound patterns. That's a really good question. So there's a question here, are there lists for these patterns like the academic word list? Those 2 websites I gave you earlier are actually the best way to approach this. So go onto those websites. I think one was morewords.com, put in the letter pattern, and it just brings up lists for you. Okay, so that's a really good resource to go back to for this approach. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is make sure you take a systematic approach that uncovers the patterns, and then you want to do immediate corrective feedback with your students. And here, number 3 is the one that we often gets left out, is you want to do repeated practice. We always think that, we can just give our students something once, and then if we do it 2 or 3 times, it gets too boring. Drill and kill is the way to go with spelling. There's no shortcut here. So you have to do a lot of repeated practice. Yeah, so we've got a question here that with lower level students, there are a lot of patterns and exceptions to learn. So is it better to focus on just memorizing spelling through repetition? The answer is both yes and no. Remember that we've got phonological processing and then we've got orthographic processing. And so phonological processing helps us identify these patterns. Okay, so we're identifying here are the letter patterns, and the sounds that go together with them. And then orthographic processing is just memorizing the word. So with our low-level students, what we want to have them do is we want to go for memorization with high-frequency short words, but then we do want to start to teach them the high-frequency patterns so that they can activate their phonological processing as well. So we want to actually do both. So there's memorization of short high-frequency words, And then there's learning of these patterns, these high frequency patterns, so that they can start to break down words as well and use their phonological processing. So hopefully that answers that question. So step number 3 in this approach to teaching spelling is one that we often skip over, but we can't, because repetition, repetition, repetition is the way that students get proficient at spelling. Okay. And number 4, we've already talked about, you want to teach for patterns. Okay. So these are key elements to your spelling instruction that you always want to keep in mind. And you always want to keep in mind that there's no shortcut here. Students have to practice their spelling. Okay. They're not going to absorb it naturally. So I'm going to walk you through some activities that really help us focus on these patterns and help students recognize the sound patterns and the letter patterns. So the first one helps students realize what, so the students have to match the words together that have the same vowel sounds in them. So they're looking for letter patterns that have a specific vowel sound. So we would just give them a word. And so here we're looking at all the sounds that can be represented by the combination of OU. Okay. I won't have you do this because we're going to have time constraints, but so you might give students a list. Here are all the words that have this OU combination in them, what sounds are represented, and your students should be able to figure out that you've got these different sounds. You don't need to have your students use the phonemic transcription, but students should recognize that there are 6 different sounds represented by OU in this list of words. Okay, you can actually start this type of activity as low down as high beginner, just with very short words and very simple letter patterns. As low as high beginner, students should be able to start to recognize these patterns. So you want to activate that phonological processing as early as possible. Okay. So that's one type of activity. Give students letters that have the same, lists of words that have the same letter combinations, and then they have to pull out which sounds are represented by these letters. Okay. And then here's an activity that kind of takes the opposite approach. So we've got words that have the same sounds, and students have to figure out which letters represent those sounds. So you can give students a mix of words, and they have to find pairs of words that have the same sounds in them. In this case, they're going after pairs of words that have the same vowel sounds in them. Okay, so you start to see that a lot of good spelling activities really have students looking for patterns. Okay, these are very, very much self-discovery type activities. So students in this case should have been able to figure out that we had these particular pairs of words that had the same vowel sounds in them. Okay. Then for when students start to get more proficient, you can actually give them text. So give them reading text and then tell them to go through the reading text and circle all of the words that have specific letter combinations. Okay. So give them a text and they have to circle all the words that have SC in them or all the words that have EA in them. Okay, and then have them take the next step and identify, okay, with this particular combination of words, what are the sounds that are represented? So use real texts that students would obviously read at their level, have them do searches for words with specific letter patterns, okay? Or they can search for words that have a specific sound and then just circle all of those words. Okay, once again, you're having students look for the patterns. Another activity is to have students create spelling word maps. So in the middle of the word map goes a particular sound or a particular letter combination. So for example, SC could go in the middle. And then students have to fill out their word map and write down all of the words that have SC in them that they know. Okay. Or you could have in the middle the sound A. And students have to fill out the word map with all the words they know that have "a" in them. Okay, so get them visually creating word maps based on either letter combinations or sounds. Another great activity for students on all levels is to have them keep a word study notebook. And how this is organized, it's a bit different than a vocabulary book. What they do is on one page, they have all the words with a specific letter pattern or letter combination in it. Or they have one page with all the same sound on it. Okay, I've got a question here. Does repeating the spelling letter by letter or saying the word help retention? And the answer is actually both, okay? Because saying the word gives you a whole word type approach, whereas spelling it letter by letter activates that phonological spelling or phonological processing approach where you're basically building the word based on that sound letter correspondence. So it's a very Canadian answer to your question. It's actually both. You want to both get students repeat spelling letter by letter or saying the whole word and saying the whole word at the same time. Okay. Going back to this word study notebook. So students at all levels should be keeping a word study book that has a list by page of letter combinations. So they'll have a page that's all the SC words, for example, or all of the HY words or all of the PH words that they're learning. Okay, or they can have by sound, so they can have a page with all of the words that they know and a page of all of the words that they know. So get students to really organize their vocabulary and word learning by sound and letter patterns. Activity 6 is, you might think this is an old-fashioned activity. It's dictation. And I know dictation got a bad rap, but it's an activity that we do need to bring back into our classrooms in order to help our students with spelling. However, we're going to fashion this dictation according to either sound patterns or letter patterns. So you could have a list of words that you're dictating, and all of those words have the same sound in them. So you could have a dictation of all the words, for example. Or you could have a dictation that has the same letter combination in it. So, for example, you could have a dictation with all of the SC words in it. Okay, so bring dictations back into your classroom, but organize them a little bit differently than you might have in the past. Organize them either by sound or by letter combinations. Okay. Spelling bees. Once again, this is kind of an old-fashioned activity, but it's a great one. But put the twist on there again. Have your spelling bee focusing on letter combinations or specific sounds and all of the letters that represent those sounds. So bring back the good old-fashioned spelling bee, especially if you have competitive students. This is a great way to get your students working on their spelling. But just put that twist in, focus on either one sound or specific letter combinations. I'm glad there's someone else who thinks dictations are great and not old-fashioned. With your students intermediate, actually, you can take this as low as high beginner, actually. Have students write a poem on a topic of their choice, but with a designated sound rhyming patterns. So poems are really great, a really great way for students to work with their phonological processing. We've done poetry work with students as low as high beginners, just that the poem is a very simple structure, a very simple rhyming structure. Okay, so poems are another great activity. They also allow students to be creative with spelling practice. So it gives them an opportunity to practice that. So I've got a question here. Is there any research on dictation for words versus sentences? I didn't come across anything like that in the research that I was doing, so I unfortunately can't answer that question. So if anyone has an answer to whether it's better to approach dictation as isolated words or as whole sentences, we'd love to hear an answer to that. Okay, so we've got poem writing there. And then the final activity that I'll mention is to teach spelling through morphemes. Remember way back when I was talking about all of the different skills that are required in order to spell well, and knowledge of morphemes is a knowledge that we want to layer in with our students, at least starting at the intermediate level. And so we can teach spelling by breaking words into their morphemes, their smallest units of meaning. And then students can realize, okay, with this particular combination, here's what it means, or with this meaning, here's how I spell it. Okay, so the use of morphemes is another great activity at the intermediate level and above. Here are the two pieces of, or the two resources that I used to come up to build this presentation, or two more resources anyway. This article by Kristen Sayevsky is great. Even though it's targeted at the K-12 system and it's targeting how to teach spelling to students with learning disabilities, all of the information in here is highly relevant to the ESL situation. All of her techniques that she mentions and quite a bit of the research also relates directly back to ESL students. So I highly recommend that you take a look at this book, and then, this article. And then this is a great book. It's very practical. It has lots of great practical ideas in terms of how to approach teaching spelling with your students. Okay. So I'll just do a quick recap, and then I'll open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, get those ready. So what we've covered is, first of all, why it's important to teach our students spelling. So there's a lot of reasons, and the research really supports this, that spelling does need to be in our ESL classrooms. Okay, it helps. Good spellers are good readers, they're good writers, they use their full range of vocabulary, and good spellers are perceived as being professional and competent and educated. Okay. Then we looked at what spelling actually is. And if you recall, there's those three pieces to spelling. There's the phonemic awareness, so knowing sounds. Then there is alphabetic awareness, knowing the alphabet system. And most importantly, and most challenging for English, there's knowing how to map those two together. So mapping the sounds onto the symbols. Okay. Then we looked at different ways to approach helping our students to uncover patterns. So we looked at homophones, homographs, and homonyms. We looked at some of the different letter patterns and the words that they originate from. So the Norse-based words, the French, Latin-based words, and so on. Then we looked at some of the influences, just really fun information for you to give students to help them understand the background to English spelling, the influences of the Great Vowel Shift, for example, the influence of the printing press. And then we looked at different approaches to teaching spelling, and all of these activities really focus on helping students uncover those patterns, either uncovering the letter patterns or the sound patterns. So we really want to take that patterned approach, okay? I've had the request to put up the recommended books again, so I'll do that. And yes, I'll give you information about where to find the slides, but I do want to open it up to any questions. So if anyone has any questions that they want to put out there or areas that they want more clarification on, now's the time to get yourself heard. Okay. And I'll also type in, if you want a copy of the slides, I will just give you an email. You can send me an email address to, and I will forward you a copy of the slides. So shoot me an email to info@aceducation and a copy of the slides, okay? So while I've been talking, there have been some great suggestions for other resources to look at. So if you have a few minutes, scroll back down through the chat area and make note of some of the resources that people have mentioned. We've got Rummy Roots. That one sounds fun. There have been a few different online tools people have mentioned. So scroll back through that and take a look at those resources. It's a really good question from Sherry out in Calgary. So if good spellers make good readers, does that translate that good readers make better spellers? And it's actually very true. The two mutually influence each other. So another activity actually to have students become better spellers is just to give them a lot of reading. So have students do in-class reading and also do extensive reading at home. So reading for pleasure at home will actually make them better spellers. So it's a really good point that this reading, spelling influence, it's two-way, okay? And same thing, this writing, spelling influence is two-way. The more students write and the more they practice their spelling through actual free writing and fluent writing, the better speller will be. It's not a one-way relationship, it's a two-way relationship. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? I will make one. I ran this session at a conference probably about 4 months ago, and after I had gone through the conference, someone said, well, so at the end of the day, we still have to have our students memorize the patterns. And so it was like, oh no, my presentation didn't get any message across. Yes, at the end of the day, there is still memorization that has to happen. Students have to memorize that there are these letter patterns match these sounds. But the more we can make students aware of these patterns, the more manageable the task of English spelling becomes. So it's not that there are no exceptions, there are, but all of these patterns, they come from somewhere. And so when we can start making spelling manageable for our students by starting to get them to hunt for these patterns. So the more patterns students know, the better they are able to spell. There are a lot of patterns to learn, but what you want to do is focus on the high frequency patterns, okay? So I've got another question here. The issue is that spelling seems to become more important when students, whoops, it just went out of my range here, when students reach higher levels. But teaching spelling is really quite time intensive. It's a really good comment. This stuff is time intensive, but as Claudia said in her comment, it's totally worth putting the time in. Here's a question. Do you think it's useful to also teach the IPA? It's a really interesting question. And a lot of our ESL students who are coming in as international students, so at the higher levels, they already know the IPA. So it's not a bad thing if students are coming in with that to actually use that in your teaching of spelling. I'll be quite frank, I don't think it hurts. At the lower levels, if they're not familiar with IPA, the IPA system might be too overwhelming, but if students are coming in with some IPA background, it's a really good tool to tap into to help them with their English spelling. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that answered any other questions. Okay, here's a question. Does the research show that frequent short sessions are more useful than infrequent longer sessions? And the answer is yes. So I would recommend doing short, targeted, more frequent spelling sessions rather than longer, less frequent sessions. So rather than having a whole 45-minute or hour lesson on spelling, every day do a 5 or 10-minute targeted session on spelling. So short, quick, frequent spelling sessions is definitely the way to go there. Let's see if I'm using the words students already use in speech. So this is a good point from Louisa that it is actually good to, when you're tackling spelling, start with words students already know. So they already have them in their spoken production capability. Rather than starting with random words, it's a really good point because you want to start, especially at the beginner level, you want to start with the high frequency words. And these are words that students probably already know. So yeah, it's a really good point, Louisa. Tackle the spelling patterns with words students already know, because you don't want this to become an activity where students are spending all their time looking up obscure words in the dictionary simply because those particular obscure words happen to have that particular letter pattern that you're going after. So rather than this becoming a vocabulary exercise, make sure you stick to words that students know so it becomes a spelling exercise, not a vocabulary exercise. Okay. Let me just flip back to that David Crystal book for you, Jerry. It's here somewhere. Oh, there it is. There's the David Crystal book. There's a comment here that sometimes things that are an exception are also easily remembered. It's actually a really good point. Very often I'm thinking of the Greek-based words here, like the PHs or the PHTH combinations. Interestingly, those are actually words that students remember because they are exceptions and they're very unusual, so they kind of stand out. So it's a really good point that sometimes those quirky spellings are the ones that students actually remember because they kind of stand out. So are there any questions here that I've missed?
I think you were able to capture all of those questions. You were good at watching over the chat box.
Okay, any final questions before we wrap up? Oh, I like the applause. Thank you, Jerry. Okay, so that's the presentation. I gave you my email address, so if you want a copy of these slides, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to send them out. If you want to share this information or share this presentation with your colleagues at work, please feel free. I don't mind if you use the copyrighted material to pass this information on to your colleagues at work, run a PD session on spelling with your colleagues. Please feel free to do that as well. And thanks very much for the great questions and comments and also the great resources that you've put out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dianne. This is really awesome. Very useful links, and it's really important to watch out for the patterns, right? And thanks for the examples of activities. So for those who still want to continue the discussion, you can totally do that in the Tutela page. There will be a thread under Dianne's name. So if you want, you feel free to comment on there.
Yeah, I don't have my thread up on Tutela yet, but I'm going to do it right after I finish here. So it'll be up there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you in the next session.
Thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference.